Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking with Tom Turner of the American Bonanza Society about myths about where stalls are most likely to occur in the traffic pattern and where they actually do occur. And we'll talk about the kind of training you can do to avoid those stalls. And we're looking for an airline pilot who nearly 30 years ago helped inspire a teenage girl to pursue a career in aviation, and we'll share her story. Last week in episode 175, we talked with co-founders of ForeFlight for an update on new features, and we talked with a CFI about her engine failure in a Piper Malibu. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. I hope you learned a lot from the show today, and here's the one thing I'd like to ask you to do, which is to share this show with your friends. Just look for the share button on whatever app you're using to listen to me now. Click on that and send it to a friend who you think might benefit from the show. And then follow up with him or her and suggest that they subscribe. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, we have startling numbers on how many airline pilots are out of work. A man is arrested for giving fake ATC instructions to airplanes, and a now former FAA employee is sentenced for a crime. All this and more, and the news starts now. From generalaviationnews.com, EAA launches Aero Educate for kids 5 to 18. Aero Educate, the newest youth aviation initiative from the EAA, will bring an interactive educational experience to young people ages 5 to 18 beginning in 2021. Aero Educate's web-based resource provides age-appropriate pathways to aviation and aerospace engagement, as well as career paths, according to EAA officials. A multitude of easy-to-use aviation-themed activities for teachers and EAA chapters can be used at sites ranging from classrooms to EAA chapter hangars. The best part? Everything is free for teachers and chapters across the country. Jack Pelton, EAA CEO, said, "What EAA has created with Aero Educate is a wide-ranging program where a child can reach specific goals in aviation that are achievable, affordable, and engaging. This is the next step for direct youth aviation education that was pioneered by the EAA Young Eagles program in the 1990s. Aero Educate will encourage participation from young people, their parents, teachers, and EAA chapters in a way that builds interest in aviation from initial fun to possible career paths." Since its beginning in 1992, the Young Eagles program has given free flights in GA aircraft to more than 2 million young people between the ages of 8 and 17. Elements of the new Aero Educate program include a badging program, which awards digital badges when young people complete different activities, career pathways to demystify the journey to a career in aviation, classroom activities to help educators spark interest among youth, and a database of youth aviation activities, which is creating nationwide opportunities for people to participate. Now, we interviewed EAA's Ron Connolly about this program on this week's Airplane Geeks podcast, which is episode 639, so you may want to check it out. One of the things that we talked with Ron about is that children as early as 5 years old often get an interest sparked in aviation, which then leads to a career in aviation from that early age. From planeandpilotmag.com, we finally know exactly how bad the pandemic has been for airline pilots. A survey has come out that finally puts into numbers the level of pain that commercial airline pilot community faces. The number of pilots who are now unemployed following the pandemic is staggering. The study was conducted by Goose, that's Goose, a pilot recruitment firm, along with publisher Flight Global, and it found that nearly half of all pilots worldwide are either looking for work or are furloughed. The poll found that 30% of those surveyed said that they were out of work and looking, with another 17% saying they were furloughed and awaiting further news. In addition, 6% said that they were still employed with their airline, but they were now doing non-flying work. So more than half of pilots lost their flying job as a result of the pandemic. Of those who are looking, Goose says 80% said they'd accept a cut in pay for a new job. Flight Global recruitment sales manager Katie Mann said, "It's simply a shocking reality of the state of the aviation industry that more than half of the world's pilots are not employed as pilots and flying as they have been trained to do." She went on to say that their research found that many pilots who are still employed worry about their job, with many of them actively looking at other industries as a backstop. And from a press release by Aerospace, Aerospace announces that production has commenced on serial number 1 for its 2-seat all-electric eFlyer 2 aircraft. The company is in the process of obtaining FAA Part 23 certification for the eFlyer 2 for the professional flight training mission. George Bai, CEO, said the company has contracted with Composites Universal Group, or CUG, to begin assembly of the production E-Flyer 2 fuselage, the first major component to be assembled. Quote, "We continue to make advances in the certification process. These activities commence production of the first conforming E-Flyer 2, the first of 3 planned conforming E-Flyer 2 aircraft that will be used to help complete final FAA certification." And of course, we talked with George Bai here in episode 160. So if you want to go back and learn more about the family of electric airplanes he's designing and building, you can find that at aviationnewstalk.com/160. From Britain-Norman.com, Britain-Norman to automate Islander for UK's first zero-carbon regional air transportation network. A British consortium has announced the formation of Project HEART as part of the government's Future Flight Challenge. The consortium will work on the project, by the way, which stands for Hydrogen, Electric, and Automated Regional Transportation, over 5 years to create the foundation for a fully sustainable and scalable commercial aviation network that could connect the whole of the UK. HEART aims to transform air transportation in the UK for cargo and passengers. The project will focus on transforming 9 to 19 passenger capacity aircraft and utilize up to 100 licensed GA airfields around the UK. The partnership identified the main challenges facing regional air transport, aiming to address them during the project. Each member of HEART will focus on combating a specific issue, including cutting carbon emissions to zero, reducing costs to operators and passengers, expanding regional airports, and increasing the frequency of service. As the UK's only sovereign commercial aircraft manufacturer with over 65 years of experience, Britain-Norman will work with Blue Bear Systems to automate the Islander. So that to me is probably the most interesting aspect of this, is that it looks like they're going to try and automate these aircraft. Known as a rugged workhorse, the aircraft serves in a variety of roles from passenger and cargo transport to medevac and search and rescue. Its adaptability as well as short takeoff and landing abilities has made it the backbone of communities around the world. The project's first milestone will be to demonstrate single pilot operations with an autonomous co-pilot providing access to more information and assistance than human perception alone can provide. The project's breakthroughs will allow regional air transport to compete with traditional ground services. A zero-carbon aircraft that was able to offer higher frequency services with more day return scheduling and reduced travel times could become a significant rival to road and rail journeys. In international news from planeandpilotmag.com, tragic pilot error blamed for United States Air Force Afghanistan surveillance plane crash. A year ago, news came out of Afghanistan that a USAF Bombardier E-11 surveillance plane had crashed and that the 2 crew members aboard had perished after executing a forced landing in a rugged field around 20 miles short of its hoped-for landing site, Forward Air Base Sharana. The Taliban claimed that it had shot the aircraft down, but intelligence officials said they were skeptical of the claim. As it turned out, the threat was somewhat far less sinister, yet far more tragic, if that's possible. The E-11 is a Bombardier Global Express large business jet that the Air Force converted into a high-tech surveillance plane. The plane that crashed was one of 4 in the Air Force's fleet. The crew was an hour and 45 minutes into the flight when the plane's left engine lost a fan blade, the catastrophic failure resulting in the loss of all power in that engine. The crew, however, could not determine which engine had lost power and incorrectly shut down the right engine, leading to a total loss of power on the plane. It is possible to restart a turbofan engine in flight, but investigators think the crew continued in their incorrect belief that the left engine was the operable one and never attempted to restart the right engine. Investigators also blame the crew's failure to select an emergency landing field within gliding distance. They instead were attempting to return to their departure field of Kandahar, and by the time they had chosen Sharana as an alternate, they were too far from that airfield as well. The investigation was complicated by incomplete data from the flight data and cockpit voice recorders, both of which shut down for the majority of the accident sequence. From AINonline.com, FAA Aviation weather cams coming to Hawaii. The long-awaited FAA Aviation weather cameras could soon be up and running in Hawaii. In November, the agency began engineering surveys required for the installation of the first 10 of 23 planned camera systems there. Hawaii's mountainous terrain, rapidly changing weather conditions, and vexing microclimates often render traditional weather forecast and reporting of little value. The deficiencies have long been cited as factors in aviation accidents there involving inadvertent entry into IMC and the resulting loss of control, as well as controlled flight into terrain. The NTSB and the state's helitour industry have long called for a weather camera system similar to those already installed in Alaska and Colorado. Colorado's system, installed in partnership with that state's Department of Transportation, became operational over the summer using a system of 52 cameras at 13 locations, and plans call for the addition of another 10 sites later this year. Alaska's system, which began installations in 1999 and now uses 235 cameras, continues to expand, and the state plans to add 140 cameras. Nav Canada also operates a system of 215 cameras. The value of the cameras is clear, according to the FAA, whose survey data of Alaska Part 135 operators found that the weather cams have become critical tools in decision-making and had cut unnecessary flight hours due to unreliable weather information by 64%. And I've always been a huge fan of the cameras in Alaska. I would very much like to see some cameras installed here in the state of California, particularly in many of the mountain passes, which sometimes get fogged in and, of course, prevent pilots from flying through them. From NewYorkPost.com, man charged with posing as air traffic controller giving fake flight orders. Now, this first line is kind of odd. A transistor radio buff was busted for posing as an air traffic controller in Germany. I'm not sure what a transistor radio buff is anymore, but I think they mean somebody who was using a two-way radio. The 32-year-old Berlin man was taken into custody Thursday night after police said he made contact with air traffic and gave fake flight orders. One of the aircraft he illegally contacted was a police helicopter that was dispatched to his neighborhood as part of a police raid to capture him, German officials said. During a search of the suspect's apartment, police found 2 radios that transmitted on the frequencies needed to make contact with aircraft. The suspect, whose name has not been released, is accused of making contact with both state and federal helicopters as well as passenger and transport aircraft over a 6-month period. The man had become increasingly professional with his communications, but gave potentially dangerous instructions. Fortunately, his crimes did not lead to any incidents or accidents. And finally, from BusinessInsider.com, former FAA employee maliciously caused a communications blackout between 10 planes and air traffic control over Hawaii. A federal judge sentenced Jolynn DaCosta, 48, to 2 years probation and a $5,000 fine for, quote, willfully and maliciously interfering with ATC communications in Honolulu, Hawaii. DaCosta's actions caused a communications blackout while at least 10 planes were airborne, according to the Department of Justice. On one occasion, the main and standby communication lines between air traffic control and approximately 6 planes were severed, the statement said. A second incident resulted in 4 other planes being impacted by the outages. Pilots were unable to hear directions from air traffic control for a total of 2 minutes, according to the press release. The pilot, who spoke at the sentencing, said 40 passengers on his plane were put in significant danger by the outages. DaCosta had been working for the FAA for 26 years before the incidents. She agreed to resign from her position as an airway transportation system specialist before the sentencing as part of a plea agreement. As a result, DaCosta lost her retirement benefits, estimated to have been worth more than $500,000. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll talk with Tom Turner about where you're most likely to stall in the traffic pattern. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's another fun flying destination.
Hey Max, Joey McCormick here with a fun flying destination. I recommend for anyone with the opportunity to fly into Gaston's Airport in Lakeview, Arkansas, 3 Mike 0. Located in North Arkansas is a 3,200-foot grass strip right next to the White River. The approach or departure is one way in and one way out, so make sure that you plan your flight well. They offer world-class fly fishing, lodging, and of course the opportunity to grab the proverbial $50 hamburger. They also have fuel available on the field. Thanks for all that you do. Really enjoy your podcasts, and I've added keeping up to date on them as part of my personal currency checklist.
Joey, thanks so much for sharing with us. And I had an interesting suggestion from a listener a couple of days ago who said that in the future I might want to consider a short segment to review one FAR, one federal aviation regulation each show. His comment was that that might be more widely applicable to everyone than the fun flying destinations where you might only be interested in it if you're within a few hundred miles of the location. So look forward to your feedback on that. We've got one more fun flying destination in our queue. So if you want to send more, You can record it and email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And here's an interesting tie-in to aviation regulations. I found a study that talks about fatal accidents and how many of them are associated with a violation of the FARs. Now, I got interested in this as I was watching an online presentation last month, which mentioned a relationship between FAR violations and fatal accidents. So I did some searching online, and I found a study that was done in 2005 by the FAA's Civil Aerospace Medical Institute, and of course I'll put a link to it in the show notes. The study is called Human Error and General Aviation Accidents, a comprehensive fine-grained analysis using HFACS. Now, HFACS stands for Human Factors Analysis and Classification System, and the abstract for the study reads in part, the Human Factors Analysis and Classification System, HFACS, is a theoretical-based tool for investigating and analyzing human error associated with accidents and incidents. Previous research performed at both the University of Illinois and the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute has successfully shown that HFACS can be reliably used to analyze the underlying human causes of both commercial and GA accidents. These analyses have helped identify general trends in the types of human factors issues and aircrew errors that have contributed to civil aviation accidents. The next step was to identify the exact nature of the human errors identified. So moving on to the study itself, it says, quote, in general, the unsafe act of operators, in this case of aviation, the aircrew, can be loosely classified as either errors or violations. Errors represent the mental or physical activities of individuals that fail to achieve their intended outcome. Not surprising, given the fact that human beings by their very nature make errors, these unsafe acts dominate most accident databases. Violations, on the other hand, are much less common and refer to the willful disregard for the rules and regulations that govern the safety of flight. Now, moving down into the study, question 3, which they posed was, previous research in other aviation venues, e.g. military aviation, has shown that violation of the rules tend to be associated with a larger proportion of fatal accidents. Will the same pattern exist in GA accidents, or will other errors more readily distinguish fatal from non-fatal accidents? And they have a diagram here in which they show that they analyzed a total of 3,256 fatal accidents and 11,180 non-fatal accidents that were each associated with some type of unsafe act. They say the overall analysis of GA accidents reveals a picture of human error within GA that was not possible before the development of HFACS. Specifically, the data indicated that skill-based errors were associated with the largest proportion of GA accidents. They say that 79.2% of the total accidents had skill-based errors, followed by decision errors, which were 29.7%, violations of the FARs, which is 13.7%, and perceptual errors, 5.7%. And they note that many of the accidents were associated with multiple HFACS causal categories, so the numbers do not add up to 100%. They then took a look at the fatal accidents and each of the different factors involved. Now, several of them were very, very close. So they said, for example, skill-based errors, 80.6% of the accidents. Now, that's very close to the 79.2% for all accidents. They said that decision errors, 29.5%, also very close. But then they got to willful violation of the rules, and 30.5% of fatal accidents involved some violation of the rules, compared to all accidents where only 13.7% involved violation of the rules. The 5 most frequent violations for fatal and non-fatal accidents were VFR flight into IMC, procedures and directives not followed, operating aircraft with known deficiencies, hazardous maneuvers, and flight into known adverse weather. Which reminded me of the FAA's 5 hazardous attitudes, which we talked about back in episode 154. The one I'm thinking of is anti-authority, which they describe as "don't tell me." The FAA writes that this attitude is found in people who do not like anyone telling them what to do. In a sense, they are saying, no one can tell me what to do. They may be resentful of having someone tell them what to do, or may regard rules, regulations, and procedures as silly or unnecessary. However, it is always your prerogative to question authority if you feel it's in error. The antidote to anti-authority, the FAA says, is follow the rules. They are usually right. To which I might add, following the rules may also save your life. So keep that in mind. I always work incredibly hard to follow all the FARs because I've never run across one that didn't make sense, frankly. So I'd encourage you to do the same. And now here's our story about a woman who is looking for an airline pilot who helped guide her into a career in aviation. You may recall that last week we had Anise Shapiro on, a CFI, talking about her engine out in a Piper Malibu. We also had a longer version of that, which was available to Patreons at the $20 and up level. And there's a little portion of that extra audio that I'd like to share with you. She talks about an airline pilot who really made a big impact on her life and got her to follow her passion for aviation.
And I was on an American Eagle flight. It was prior to 9/11, so I was kind of like hanging out around the cockpit, and I just had the right captain. He walked over, he said, "Hey, sit down." So I did. He's like, "Ask me anything you want." And so I started asking all these questions about the cockpit. And he's like, "You seem super interested in aviation. You should be a pilot." And I was like, "Well, I don't know. I'm a girl." And so he said, "So job quotas, they're going to give you my job." And I was like, "I'm really short." He said, "Well, more room in the cockpit." I was like, "I wear contacts." And he said, brought out his glasses. He was like, "You have to see better than an old man. Stop making excuses." So I remember laughing. I was like, "Well, it's expensive." And he said, "Don't let money stop you from your dreams." So it was kind of that moment in time, like it really sat with me. And I came back and I talked to my dad. He's super supportive. And I told him the whole story. I was like, "Dad, I think I really want to try to fly." And he had a friend that he finished his license. He was taking lessons. And he was like, "Hey, I'll call my friend and maybe I can get you set up with, a flight." So I did a discovery flight and I was in love the first time. And the guy said, "She's a natural. You should let her pursue this." And so my dad said, "Okay, if you get a job, I'll pay half if you pay half." And I kept going and I got a job at Addison Airport and I ran a flight school and I was able to pay for it that way and kept going. And next thing you know, I'm flying jets and all kinds of airplanes and living the dream.
Wow, that's remarkable. So at age 19, you had all kinds of barriers in your mind as to why it wouldn't be possible. And yet this airline captain met every objection and basically said, "Yes, you can live your dream."
Yes, it was a slap in the face. Like, "Hey, stop. Think about it seriously. Anybody can do this."
Wow,
so
sounds like it was
in my life in that moment for a reason.
Right. Yeah, no, it sounds like just a major turning point in your life. What, if you could find this captain again, what would you say to him?
Oh my gosh. Thank you. I always get kind of like teared up. I really wish I could find him because he changed the trajectory of my life.
Maybe we can find him. What year was that?
I believe it was 93, the summer of 93.
And which airport were you at?
And I was
American
on
Eagle?
a flight from Seattle to Dallas.
Okay. And this happened in Seattle or Dallas?
It was on the way back. So we had landed in Dallas.
Got it. All right. Super. Well, maybe we can find that captain. I think that's just
I
amazing.
would love it. He definitely, I'm sure he has changed a lot of people's lives, but he definitely put that bug in my ear and I kept going.
Well, and I hope that there are lots of airline captains who might say, "Oh yeah, that could have been me," because that's the kind of thing that I do.
Yeah, exactly. You hope so for sure, because they should also realize, I mean, I hope it gets out there because they should realize aviation's changed a little bit, where I don't know if it's back when we were younger and you'd see an American or any type of pilot, right, when you were flying around commercially and you're like, "Oh my gosh, they're so special." Almost like a hero. Now it's so normal that I hope they realize still that it's not. It's so incredible every time I fly, when I realize where I am and what I'm doing and how special it is, and no one else is experiencing exactly what I'm experiencing in that moment. So I hope they realize it can really change.
All right, let's get to work now. If you think you have any clue as to who that airline captain might have been, please get in touch with me here at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com, and we'll connect you with Anise. And here are a couple messages that came in about last week's show, episode 175. This comes from Patreon supporter Mark Finkelstein. He says, "I would absolutely love more interviews with pilots who dealt with emergencies. By the way, the first part of the podcast devoted to new ForeFlight features was terrific. I had ForeFlight up on my iPad and followed along, learning a lot. Even so, I always feel that I'm just scratching the surface with ForeFlight. What a great pilot tool. Thanks again for all the fantastic work you do. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Lance Fletcher, who's at the $20 or above level, so he's able to see our bonus videos. He says, Max, loved the video with the ForeFlight guys. I had my screen open working through their demonstration. Great to see the constant improvements they are making. And as you say, the increase in margin. And of course, there I was talking about how you want to build an extra margin in every aspect of your flying to increase your safety. He says, keep up the great work with the podcast, Lance. Well, thank you, Mark and Lance. I greatly appreciate your feedback, and I appreciate everyone who supports the show in any way. If you'd like to support us financially, a couple of easy ways to do that. You can just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and sign up via Patreon. Use a credit card, and you can donate each month. We have all kinds of goodies available. For example, at the $20 a month level, people get to see the bonus videos that I post. And you can also make either a one-time donation or a monthly donation via PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And you don't even need a PayPal account. All you need is a credit card. We've got a couple new mega supporters. These are the folks who donate $50 a month or more. One is Michael Rahn, R-A-H-N. I hope I said that correctly. He runs a small wealth management firm in Woodland, Texas, which you can find at SUM planning.com. And he says he's thinking of buying a Cirrus. And also Todd Cussall, he's a longtime supporter who just edited his pledge up to $50 a month. He lives in Arizona and flies an SR20 Turbo G5. And we have a number of other new patrons who joined us this past week. They include Don Durston, Emmanuel Parasakakis, edited up to $20 a month, Patricia Burris, also $20 a month, Jay Jacobs, Michael Lemke, Martin Goodman, who edited his pledge up to $20 a month, and Mike Connell at $20 a month. We also have a new monthly PayPal supporter, which is Rick Crockett at $20 a month. Thank you all so much for supporting the show. And once a month, I read the list of all of our mega supporters who donate more than $50 a month. And I was thinking I might end up in the future splitting this out to read just 1/4 of the list each of 4 different weeks. Let me know if you'd prefer that I do that. But for now, here's the list. Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California, flies a Turbo 206. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight. Bruce Dickerson, financial planner living in Georgia, who flies a K-35 Bonanza. Victor Vogel, he's a doc who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, wealth manager in Santa Rosa. He flies an SR-22 out of the Santa Rosa airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composites, which make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. Seth Lake, he is a DPE. We had him on the show recently. He specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his beach travel airs. You can find out more about him at vsl.aero. Rick Miller instructs in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Cessna's, Pipers, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He'd love to teach full-time, but he still has that day job. Justin Winter brokers real estate on Lake Keowee in South Carolina and flies an SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation have a pair of Cessna T240 aircraft and a 2021 Piper M350 on order. Johnny McDade, he's a singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss flies out of the Republic Airport on Long Island in New York. I know he's got a check ride coming up. He just told me about that. He is working on his CFII and MEI, and he's currently giving ground instruction at Pilot Proficiency International. You can find him on his Facebook page at Ground.9, and he gives individual instruction in person or online. Charlie Mason flies out of Austin, Texas, is working on his instrument rating. Vincent Salimi, he's the vice mayor for the city of Pinole here in California and the owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco. Jim Hopp is a CFI. He teaches at Advantage Aviation at Palo Alto Airport in California. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours on his new Vision jet. Josiah Freeman working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's an AME in Florida at the Naples Municipal Airport. So if you need a medical, a basic med, second or third class flight physical, you can contact them at aviatorsclinic.com. And William Birch donates the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses at iFlyIFR.com. Stephen Bush, he's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. If you want to get your helicopter rating, check them out at lonestarheli.com. Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI and flies a Bonanza. Rick Mattis, he's an owner of PointWise, which makes CFD, computational fluid dynamics software used by aerospace companies. You can find them at pointwise.com. John Tosto lives in Flint, Michigan, and rents planes at the Greater Flint Pilots Association. He also owns a Cherokee 6 that's been updated with a Garmin G3X and GTN 650. Vic Bajaj, here out of the San Francisco Bay Area, who flies a new Cirrus SR20. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires in a few years. He runs BoddenSteel.com, which manufactures industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he flies a DA-40 out of Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps children with dyslexia. Greg Van, he's a senior AME at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. We've mentioned his podcast that he hosts, which is the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach, which discusses medical issues for pilots. James Kerr is thinking about buying an SR-22 for business travel. His company makes security screens for protecting your home. You can find out more at bosssecurity.screens.com. Orel English is a CFI and CFII at the Westchester Flying Club at Westchester County Airport. He and a friend have created a website to make free flight planning modern and fast. The site's called Flyway, and you can check it out at flyway.cc. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He says his 2-year-old son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch and Michael Ron and Todd Cussall, who we both just talked about. Thanks so much for everyone who donates to the show in whatever way you donate. Coming up next, Tom Turner talking about where you're likely to stall in the traffic pattern. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Tom Turner. Tom spent 6 years in the Air Force and was a Minuteman Missile Combat Crew Commander. Later, he earned a master's degree in aviation safety. He's since held a number of flying jobs, including a 5-year period when he was a lead instructor at Flight Safety International, responsible for all factory-approved training for the Beach Bonanza. In 2003, he became the manager of technical services for the American Bonanza Society, and he's currently the executive director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. He holds an ATP certificate and was named the 2010 National FAA Safety Team Representative of the Year and was inducted into the Flight Instructor Hall of Fame in 2015. And here's our conversation with Tom Turner, and I should note that Patreon supporters at the $20 and up level can actually see a video version of this, including the slides that Tom showed as we were talking. Well, Tom, welcome back to Aviation News Talk. It's great to have you here again.
Thanks for asking, Max. It is great to be back.
So I called you up because I had seen a recent edition of your Flying Lessons newsletter, and in it you had what I thought was a really interesting topic, talking about where in the traffic pattern stalls actually occur versus where people think they occur. But first, let's talk about the Flying Lessons newsletter. I have been subscribing to that for many, many years. Tell people what that is, how long you've been doing it, and what it's all about.
All right. Well, Flying Lessons Weekly is a blog that I've done actually pretty much since 1998 in one form or another. So I've been doing it for a while. What I do with Flying Lessons Weekly is to look at an accident or incident report that is making the rounds of internet chatter over the last week or so and see what positive lessons we can derive from what we know about that so far. I don't attempt to explain what happened in that specific example because the investigators haven't done their work yet at that point. But almost always something will come to mind that because this may be a possibility, it's the sort of thing that we need to think about every time we fly. It's free. It comes out usually late Wednesday evening Central Time at my personal website, which is mastery-flight-training.com, masteryflighttraining.com. And you can subscribe there. It will come out to you free.
That's super. And I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can get there easily to subscribe to the newsletter. Let's talk about stalls in the traffic pattern. I'm asking listeners right now, think about where you think you are most likely to encounter a stall in the traffic pattern. And then, Tom, go ahead and tell us what the common myth is, and then talk more about where stalls actually do occur in the traffic pattern.
Okay, Max. Well, of course, my employment is with American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation, and I do quite a bit of accident tracking for the Beechcraft airplanes as part of that, in addition to what I do outside of that in my mastery flight training work. And it's been going on now. About 2005, I did a bit of a deep dive into NTSB records to see where Beechcraft, Bonanza, and Debonair airplanes stall. When an NTSB report indicates an aerodynamic stall, where in the traffic pattern does that occur? And I came up with some data that seemed quite unusual. Back when we used to do live events a lot, I would frequently start a program asking people that very question you just did. Where in the traffic pattern do you feel like you are most likely to experience a stall? And virtually everyone will say, well, in the base to final turn, or sometimes in the turn from downwind to base leg, but usually the base to final turn. And I found in my investigation back in 2005 that at least in the Bonanza and Debonair world, that really isn't borne out by the data at all. Now, a couple of years ago, AOPA's Air Safety Institute published this report in 2017, Stall and Spin Accidents Keep the Wings Flying. And this looks at the stall spin accident record across the general aviation fleet. And what I found was that what AOPA found in its research exactly mirrors what I found in mine specific to Bonanzas and Debonairs. So it validates the research that I'd done earlier, but it reinforces the perhaps skewed feeling that we have of what stall accidents are like. And in my opinion, it gives us some ideas of how to address stall training in the future to avoid the most common sorts of accidents.
One of the things that really struck me about that was just the number of stall accidents. In that study, they said from 2000 to 2014, there were 2,015 stall accidents. That's a huge number. When you divide that out, that comes to 143 stall accidents per year. So I think stalls are probably a lot more common than most pilots realize.
They really are, and that is an incredible number. And another thing that the AOPA study bore out was that only about half of those happen in the traffic pattern. A lot of the stall-related accidents occur when people are doing, they're buzzing, low-altitude flight, low-altitude maneuvering. In multi-engine airplanes and multi-engine training, we have a lot of single engines, a comparatively large number of single-engine stalls. But it really does reinforce why loss of control in flight in general aviation airplanes has been on the NTSB's most wanted list off and on for several years. They are really common. So looking at the data, where accidents actually occur, again, according to AOPA's report of NTSB reports, the downwind to base and base to final turn stalls only account for 3.8%. Only about 4% of all of the stalls in the traffic pattern happen at those points in the pattern where we think they're most likely to occur. And this is real-world data from NTSB reports. Now, when a stall occurs in the base to final turn or the downwind to base turn, they have a high level of lethality. You don't have much room to recover from those altitudes. And so if you do stall there, unfortunately, you're not likely to survive it. About 66% of all of the downwind to base turn stalls resulted in death, and a whopping 80% of the base to final turn stalls were fatal. So what we're thinking about here, there really are low frequency but high impact events. The reality is you're not very likely to stall in that base to final turn historically. If you do, it's not going to turn out well. So I looked at other places in the traffic pattern. Next, I looked on final approach itself. After wings level on final approach, we have half again as many stalls. About 6% of all of the stalls happen at that point. They tend to be fairly high lethality events also. About 40% of those are lethal. And it may be that they're more frequently survivable because you're closer to the ground when it happens. You don't have the time to accelerate after the stall occurs. But you actually see more turns, more stalls, wings level on final approach than you see in that turn onto final approach. A couple other places in the traffic pattern on the downwind leg and wings level on the base leg, as you would expect, rarely is a stall scenario. Only about 0.8% of all the stalls happen on these wing level portions of the pattern, and about half of those are fatal. You have a better chance, especially on the downwind leg, of recovering if the plane does stall there. And then lastly, kind of surprisingly, I think, in the landing flare is where we start to see a lot of the stall accidents occur. 21.2%, about 1/5 of all of the reported stalls in the traffic pattern happen during the landing flare. Now, only about 8% of those are fatal. Now, why is that? You're pretty close to the ground at that point. And if the plane does stall a little higher than you plan for it to on final approach, you probably will still survive it. We don't even usually think about these as stall accidents. Most of us would consider this to be a hard landing. But from the NTSB data, about 1/5 of them happen during the landing flare.
And of course, we never see hard landings, right?
Of course not. Now, the objective, of course, is to try to stall, 3 or 4 inches above the pavement, and the problem happens if you try to do it at 6 or 8 feet up. That's where those happen.
Yeah, in fact, what we usually teach a good landing would be you stall, but you're right, it would be very close. At any time, certainly when I'm with a client, if they're up, 5, 6 feet above the ground and we're getting slow, it's like, whoa, that we need to take action.
That's right. I tell my students when I'm flying with them that at certain portions of the flight, you will see my hands to go to what I call the defensive position, and that would be one place there. Yes.
Yes, that's where we say, I have the controls.
I have the controls. Right. Okay. So surprisingly, then, if you look at everything on the arrival end of the traffic pattern, everything from downwind through the turn onto base leg, the base itself, the turn to final approach, and the flare, this only accounts for about 32%, 31.9 actually percent of all of the reported stall accidents. Significantly, these arrival end accidents, these are really power off stall scenarios. And it's still only, a little less than 1/3 of all of those that occur. So here's where the really interesting data begins. Where do the stalls happen more frequently? Just under 18% of them happen at the initial part of a go-around or a balked landing. When you're coming down final approach, if you need to initiate a go-around and you apply power, in many airplanes, this will also result in a fairly rapid pitch up as you apply power, especially if you're a little surprised by the need to go around and a little hasty with the power application. And so actually, power on stall here at the beginning of a go-around happens more frequently than any other part of the arrival part of the traffic pattern, except for in the flare itself. About 1/4 of these accidents are fatal, but because so many more of them are occurring, we see this reported more frequently as a fatal accident cause. And then the real surprise, at least for me when I looked at these data, both when I computed them myself for Bonanzas and Debonairs and then reinforced by the AOPA report, is that 50% of all of the reported stalls in the traffic pattern happen on initial climb on the upwind leg. This is, if you're going to stall in your airplane, it's going to be on takeoff or in a go-around, most likely. As a matter of fact, those two combine for almost 70% of all of the reported stalls. So that's really impressed me quite a bit. Just kind of doing a quick wrap up of this, where we think we stall in the base to final turn and in the downwind to base turn is only a combined 10% of all of the stall reported accidents, according to AOPA study, whereas 89.3%, 90% of all of the stalls happen somewhere over the pavement or on the departure end of the runway, either during the flare or especially the initial takeoff and the go-around. One distinction, especially for the takeoff and go-around stalls, is that those are power-on stalls. And in my opinion, anyhow, my impression is that pilots and even flight instructors are more confident and comfortable performing power off stalls. They're generally a very benign maneuver, and we do them a lot in training. We're comfortable going out and practicing them ourselves because they're usually a pretty gentle event. When we go practice power on stalls, however, there's a lot of trepidation both among pilots and flight instructors. A power on stall is often a very dynamic sort of stall event and requires a fairly substantial recovery technique. And it's also something of an artificial event, the way that we teach and evaluate them. The way that most stall training is done is with the airplane in a clean configuration, with the flaps up, if it's a retractable gear airplane, with the gear up. And frequently, we do it with less than full power available, usually at maybe 2/3 power or something. And that even in that case, we have to bring the nose well above the horizon in order to create this power on stall scenario. And so as we're going through this, as a student or as a pilot practicing this, I'm thinking, let's get this over with. Pull. Oh, finally you gave up and you do your recovery. And one of the things that reinforces is that the nose has to be radically above the horizon for the airplane to perform a power on stall. And secondly, you have to work really hard to make it happen in the first place. So you can get complacent about them and think, well, there's no way I would actually get into that situation. What the record, I think, is telling us, though, is that the scenarios where power on stalls really occur happen at, obviously low altitude, and that's a factor, but often happen when there is maybe some flap extended and the landing gear is extended in a retractable gear airplane. And so the rate of deceleration is going to be more rapid. And even with full power, starting from what is a normal climb speed and climb attitude, it only takes a little additional pitch upward beyond that for the airplane, for the wing to exceed its critical angle of attack. And the stall actually occurs at a much lower pitch attitude. My contention, training this a lot with folks, and I point this out when I train them, is that if you are to get into one of these most common stall scenarios, you're seeing the indications perhaps for the first time ever, because we don't practice stalls in a dirty configuration, power on stalls in a dirty configuration. We don't practice them at the beginning of a go-around maneuver when the trim may be fairly nose high and the airplane really wants to pitch up on recovery. So the way that we train and evaluate stalls isn't fully preparing us for these real-world scenarios where the stall occurs. And so my takeaway from all of these data is that I think we're doing a very good job of training pilots to recognize, recover from, and especially avoid stalls on the arrival end of the traffic pattern. That's in large part, I think, because everybody thinks this is where you're most likely to stall. So we pay attention to that. We watch for the indications. We practice it more frequently. The reality is, though, that we tend to stall on the high power departure end, and we don't practice that as much. So we don't need to practice the arrival stalls, the power off stalls, any less frequently. We need to focus more on training the power on stalls in real world scenarios as well.
I think a really key thing on the departure is to train pilots to look at the pitch attitude almost immediately after they take off. And I find some pilots don't instinctively do this. They don't consider it one of the first things that they have to do. Certainly one of the first things I look at shortly after rotation is, where is the nose relative to the horizon? Where it's going to be is going to differ depending upon the aircraft. If I were just to take a Cessna 172, in general, the top of the glare shield is going to, or actually, the nose, the forward part of the cowling is going to be close to the horizon where the sky meets the ground. Now, it might be slightly different in your airplane, maybe slightly above, slightly below the horizon, but that's a fairly common place for most aircraft to end up when they're in the proper climb attitude. I think it also helps to know if you're looking at your instruments, just how many degrees of pitch up is that. But that's not your primary indication of your VFR. Your primary indication is looking out the window and visually confirming that pitch attitude and making sure it's where it should be. And if it's not, then you really need to jump on that quickly to adjust it.
Right. I talk a lot about pitch attitude in terms of 7 degrees up, 10 degrees up in training and writing about these sorts of things. But what I really mean is learn what the visual sight picture is for a 10 degree up pitch attitude, which is common in maybe the Bonanza and Cirrus class of airplanes at initial takeoff if you're aiming for VY. But one of the things you said, Max, is really important. We tend to think in terms of pitching or aiming for an indicated airspeed initially on takeoff, and that's true. We're aiming really for an angle of attack, and airspeed is our surrogate for that. But airspeed is an outcome. It's not something we set. It's something that occurs because of other things we've done, and it's not an instantaneous reaction. So if you aim for the pitch attitude, and assuming that your aircraft's power and configuration are correct, it will get to the airspeed that equates to that attitude. So it really is a matter of learning what it's supposed to look like for takeoff and making certain that you get that same picture every time.
I agree. It makes total sense. Set the pitch attitude and then wait and see what the airspeed settles out at, and then make tiny variations from that. I think another area where people can get in trouble is going to be on the go-around. And I think the key issue is that if you are configured for landing, the airplane is trimmed for a given airspeed. If you suddenly give it full power and, of course, right rudder, the nose is going to pitch up dramatically to try and maintain that airspeed. And often that pitch it assumes is going to be higher than a normal climb-out pitch attitude. So I think people, anytime they're coming in for a landing, they have to be kind of thinking ahead of time, this might be a go-around. And if it is, I know that 3 things are going to go forward. The right side of my body is going to go forward, the throttle, the right rudder pedal, but also my left hand is going to have to push forward on the yoke, because if I don't, I'm most likely going to be pitched up much higher than the normal pitch attitude when you climb out.
Exactly. And depending on the type of aircraft, a lot of training aircraft, and this may be a law of primacy. It's something that's reinforced when we first learn to fly that may not be exactly applicable to the type of plane we're flying later on. A lot of training airplanes, if you're on final approach with your final flaps set and coming down normally and trim off the pressures, the elevator trim will be somewhere very close to the normal takeoff position. But when you get into more powerful airplanes or aircraft that have a wider center of gravity envelope available to them, or maybe very nose-heavy aircraft, if it's like the Bonanzas I fly, the Cirruses that you fly tend to be nose-heavy, especially if they have a turbo, you'll find that trimming on final approach results in a pitch trim setting that is substantially more nose-up than takeoff. So when you apply power, it will, as you said, attempt to seek the airspeed for which it's trimmed, but it doesn't know exactly what attitude it's going to take to do that. It just knows, I'm much slower than I'm much faster than I'm trimmed for, so therefore I need to pull the nose way up, and it'll overshoot it if you let it. And so that's what you need to do, is allow the nose to come up to the correct pitch attitude, and then give it the forward pressure on the controls that's necessary to keep it from pitching beyond that.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, what do you think is that one thing that pilots can do to go out there and make sure they're prepared for these kinds of situations?
Well, first off, anticipate the need for a go-around every time you come into land. Almost 20% of the stalls happen during the go-around. So a lot of that is probably the element of surprise. So practice go-around so you know what happens with your foot and your hand and your other hand in the go-around to make it work properly. But every time you come down final approach, be critically evaluating your approach. If you need to make a go-around, that should just be another normal maneuver that you fly. The other is with an instructor who is familiar with the characteristics of your particular airplane, go out there and practice at least some incipient stalls with full power, but with full flaps, and if it's a retractable gear airplane, with the gear down. And at least what the aircraft looks and feels like in a go-around from that position and in an incipient stall. But in some airplanes, they can the stall can be very dramatic in that configuration. But if you recover at the first indication of a stall, the stall warning horn or any buffet or something like that, you get the idea of what you need to do to avoid that stall on a go around. So practice the high power end of the stall envelope as well as continuing to practice the low power end.
Yes, and I would say train. You can certainly do some of these things yourself for practice, but also there's a lot of benefit to going out with a flight instructor. Well, Tom, thank you so much for everything you do for aviation safety. Thanks so much for the Flying Lessons newsletter, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Max. I always learn every time I listen to your program as well, so thanks for having me back on.
Well, Tom is just such a great asset to general aviation, and it's great to have him back on the show again. I should mention he also runs Mastery Flight Training, through which he provides individual flight training for Beach Bonanza and Baron owners, so you may want to contact him if you fly one of these aircraft. I'll include a link to his website as well as, of course, to where you can sign up for his newsletter. Coming up next, we've got some listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to some listener feedback. This comes from Matthew from Oklahoma. He said, just listen to your podcast episode 170 on mastering the go-around. It seems to me that a lot of go-around accidents are caused by the unexpected surge of power from the full power setting that we are all trained to put in when going around or even taking off. I fly a Cessna 182, and I found that I really never need full power to take off or go around or recover from a rejected landing. I slowly put in the power I need to start climbing, and all seems to work out without having to fight the nose upward turning tendencies. What do you think of the non-full power takeoffs and go-arounds? Well, Matthew, I think I would split that up into two parts. You talked about putting the power in slowly, and I would wholeheartedly endorse that. I sometimes see people doing a go-around who will absolutely slam the power in, and frankly, mechanical objects don't like to be slammed. So I like to put the power in kind of over 1,001, 1,002, maybe over 2 seconds. But I would still use full power, both for a takeoff and for going around. I think most of the procedures you're going to read for piston aircraft say to use full power for both takeoff and go around. So that's what I would do. I would follow the procedures. And here's an email from Mark in Illinois. He said, just got around to listening to this episode. Good one. There's another option when it comes to remembering to close your IFR flight plan. I don't know anyone who doesn't carry a smartphone with them at all times. It couldn't be easier to set a reminder using either Siri for iPhone users or Hey Google for Android users. He says you could say, Hey Siri or Google, remind me to close my flight plan at, and then 1 hour past your scheduled arrival time. By the way, I would pick probably a half hour. He says your phone will chirp at the time you set, and if you're behind schedule and still airborne, the notification will persist until you manually turn it off. That means every time you look at your phone, you'll see the reminder to close your flight plan until you turn the notification off. And the key thing I would mention is that flight service is trained to start looking for you a half hour after your arrival time. So that's why I probably wouldn't use 1 hour for my notification. But great idea. I'll certainly try that in the future. Here's an email from Cliff in Ohio. He says, Max, I've listened to all 171 episodes, and I've been on a 3.5-mile walk for every single one. So by my rough calculations, that means while listening to your podcast, I've covered 600 miles in around 200 hours, burned at least 100,000 calories per my Fitbit data. Not only are you a master CFI, but you are a fitness guru. Hey, Cliff, I wrote back to him. I said, that's incredible. Glad to hear you and other listeners are getting so fit. Coincidentally, I'm just about to go out on a long walk too. I often use those walks to QA draft versions of a new show before I release them. Anytime I hear something I need to fix, I do a screenshot so I know exactly the time at which I need to make a fix. I often end up listening to the show 3 to 4 times before I release it, and by then I don't want to hear it again. But it helps a lot. In the early days, I had some episodes go out with problems, and it was always a rush to fix them as quickly as I could. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Scott DeRyan. He says, Max, I'm glad to finally be able to support you and your show. I've been a listener for over a year now, and you have been one of my only connections to GA. I'm an American airline pilot that was furloughed back in October and was recalled when the new PSP was signed into law. I'm grateful to have my job back, and since it sounds like you were back to not flying due to COVID, I thought that I better start supporting a fellow pilot. Well, thanks so much for that, and you're right, I have not returned to flying yet. I have also been using my part in using that share button with a couple of friends as well as my father. The episode I shared with my father was episode 90 because my father has the exact Mooney that the pilot in that episode crashed due to CO poisoning. This episode compelled me into buying a nice CO detector for my father and his Mooney. Thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone who sends me feedback. I'm sorry I don't get a chance to read all of it, but I certainly take a look at it and try to reply most of it, and some of it makes it here on the show. Well, that's it for this week. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.